In 2019, a seasoned economist found herself in a Caracas hotel lobby, surrounded by international correspondents rushing to file their stories. Each reporter carried the same narrative template: failed state, economic collapse, authoritarian regime. But as she listened to their conversations, she realized something profound. They weren't really talking about Venezuela. They were talking about their own certainties. The world has decided what Venezuela is: a cautionary tale, a symbol of socialist failure, a resource-cursed petro-state that squandered its wealth. This narrative is so deeply embedded in global consciousness that it has become unquestionable. But what if everything we think we know about Venezuela reveals more about how we think than about Venezuela itself? The story we tell ourselves about Venezuela is not just wrong, it's a mirror. It reflects our deepest assumptions about how economies should work, how governments should behave, and what success looks like. To understand why Venezuela confounds expectations, we must first understand the mental frameworks that create those expectations. The resource curse mythology. When analysts look at Venezuela, they see a textbook case of the resource curse. Oil wealth corrupted institutions, created dependency, and ultimately destroyed the economy. This explanation is so satisfying, so complete, that it has become canonical. But it raises an uncomfortable question. Why doesn't this curse affect every oil-rich nation equally? Norway discovered oil around the same time as Venezuela. Both countries built their modern economies on petroleum wealth, yet one is considered a model of governance while the other is labeled a failure. The standard explanation focuses on institutional quality, democratic traditions, and fiscal discipline. But this explanation obscures more than it reveals. The observer, analyzing Venezuela from Oslo or London, operates within a specific conceptual framework. They assume that natural resources are wealth that can be managed like any other asset. They assume that democratic institutions naturally create accountability. They assume that market mechanisms automatically generate efficiency. These assumptions feel like universal truths, but they are cultural products. Venezuela's relationship with oil was never about managing wealth in the conventional sense. From the moment petroleum was discovered in Lake Maracaibo in the early 20th century, it became something else entirely: a social contract written in crude. The Venezuelan state didn't extract oil to accumulate capital. It extracted oil to distribute citizenship. Consider this paradox. During Venezuela's supposed golden age in the 1970s, when oil prices soared and the government proclaimed Venezuela is swimming in money, income inequality was actually higher than it is today. The petrodollars flowed through a narrow channel of elites, while the majority remained excluded from prosperity. Yet this period is remembered as success, while the later attempts at redistribution are labeled as failure. The difference isn't economic performance, it's whose version of prosperity we're measuring. The democracy trap. Foreign observers consistently frame Venezuela's crisis as a struggle between democracy and authoritarianism. This framing seems natural, even inevitable, but it reveals a fundamental misunderstanding about what democracy means in a petro-state context. In conventional democratic theory, citizens pay taxes and elect governments to provide services. This creates a feedback loop of accountability. But what happens when the government doesn't need citizen taxation because it has oil revenue? What happens when the state can distribute benefits without requiring contributions? Venezuela developed what scholars call rentier democracy, a system where electoral legitimacy comes not from taxation representation bargains, but from resource distribution. Citizens vote not for who will tax them least, but for who will share oil wealth most effectively. This isn't a corruption of democracy. It's a different form of democracy entirely. The Chavez government understood this dynamic intuitively. Rather than trying to build conventional democratic institutions, it built a distribution apparatus. The famous social missions, Misión Barrio Adentro for healthcare, Misión Robinson for literacy, Misión Mercal for food distribution, weren't welfare programs in the traditional sense. They were democracy by other means. Western analysts condemned these programs as populist vote buying, but they misunderstood the logic. In a rentier democracy, direct distribution is more legitimate than institutional mediation. Why should oil wealth flow through Congress, courts, and bureaucracies when it can flow directly to neighborhoods? This creates a profound interpretive problem for outside observers. They see the erosion of traditional democratic institutions and conclude that democracy itself is under attack. But from the perspective of recipients of social missions, democracy was finally working. The oil wealth that had been hoarded by elites for decades was being democratized. The crisis came not because this system was inherently flawed, but because it depended on sustained high oil prices. When prices collapsed, the distribution apparatus collapsed with it. But rather than acknowledge that the system had a different logic, observers interpreted the breakdown as vindication of their original critique. The hyperinflation paradox. Nothing seems to validate the Venezuela as failure narrative more than hyperinflation. Images of people carrying wheelbarrows of cash to buy bread appear to prove that the economy has fundamentally broken down. But hyperinflation in Venezuela functions differently than economic textbooks suggest. Traditional hyperinflation theory assumes that people desperately try to get rid of money because they believe it will be worthless tomorrow. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle where velocity of money accelerates until the currency collapses completely. But in Venezuela, something stranger happened. Despite astronomical inflation rates, bolivars continued to circulate. Despite the emergence of dollar markets, bolivars retained social significance. Despite the availability of cryptocurrencies and foreign currencies, many transactions still used local money. This isn't economic irrationality, it's economic innovation. Venezuelan society developed what anthropologists call monetary pluralism. Different currencies serve different functions. Dollars for savings and major purchases. Bolivars for daily transactions and social relationships. Cryptocurrencies for international transfers. This isn't chaos, it's adaptation. The hyperinflation story that dominates international coverage focuses on the breakdown of monetary system, but it misses the more interesting story, how people create new monetary systems when old ones fail. Venezuelans didn't just survive hyperinflation, they invented alternatives to it. Neighborhood communities organized barter networks. Businesses created internal credit systems, local. Governments issued complementary currencies. These innovations don't appear in economic statistics because they don't fit standard categories, but they represent extraordinary creativity under extreme constraints. The outside world sees dysfunction because it looks for familiar patterns. When those patterns disappear, observers conclude that the system has collapsed. But Venezuelans see adaptation because they focus on what works rather than what's supposed to work. The migration narrative. Perhaps nothing shapes global perception of Venezuela more than the exodus of millions of citizens. This migration appears to offer incontrovertible proof of systematic failure. After all, people vote with their feet, and Venezuelan feet have been walking toward borders in unprecedented numbers. But migration from Venezuela tells a more complex story than simple economic flight. The profile of Venezuelan migrants challenges conventional assumptions about who leaves failing states and why. Unlike typical refugee flows, Venezuelan migration includes significant numbers of professionals, educated urbanites, and middle-class families. These aren't people fleeing immediate physical danger or absolute poverty. They're people whose life projects became impossible to realize within Venezuelan constraints. Many Venezuelan migrants aren't economic refugees in the traditional sense, they're lifestyle refugees. They left not because they couldn't survive in Venezuela, but because they couldn't live the lives they imagined for themselves. This distinction matters because it reveals different kinds of state failure. Consider the Venezuelan doctor who migrated to Colombia to work as a taxi driver. International media presents this as evidence of economic collapse, a professional reduced to menial labor. But interviews with such migrants reveal more nuanced motivations. They didn't leave because doctoring became impossible in Venezuela. They left because being a doctor in Venezuela didn't provide the social status and economic security they expected from professional life. This expectation itself reflects particular assumptions about what professional life should offer. It assumes that education should guarantee upward mobility, that professional skills should be rewarded with middle-class lifestyle, that individual merit should determine economic outcomes. These assumptions feel natural, but they're culturally specific. The Venezuelan state's response to professional migration reveals its own logic. Rather than trying to retain doctors, teachers, and engineers through salary increases or improved working conditions, it doubled down on training new professionals. Medical schools expanded enrollment. Universities created new programs. The state behaved as if professionals were replaceable rather than assets to be preserved. From a conventional economic perspective, this seems irrational. Human capital is precious and should be protected. But from a different perspective, it makes sense. If the goal is to maintain services rather than preserve professional hierarchies, training new doctors might be more effective than paying existing doctors middle-class wages. The external explanation. As Venezuela's crisis deepened, a counter-narrative emerged. This wasn't domestic failure, but external sabotage. Economic sanctions, capital flight, and international pressure explained what appeared to be internal breakdown. This narrative gained traction within Venezuela while being dismissed internationally as regime propaganda. But the role of external factors in Venezuela's crisis is more complex than either narrative suggests. International actors didn't cause Venezuela's problems, but they certainly shaped how those problems unfolded. Consider the impact of financial sanctions on Venezuelan state capacity. By freezing government assets and restricting access to international banking, sanctions made it difficult for the state to import essential goods, pay international debts, and maintain infrastructure. These effects were intended to pressure the government, but they also degraded the systems that citizens depended on. The result was a feedback loop, where external pressure created internal problems that justified more external pressure. Sanctions made it harder for the government to deliver services, which increased popular discontent, which validated international criticism, which justified more sanctions. This dynamic reveals how external and internal factors interact in complex ways. International observers see sanctions as responses to domestic failures. Venezuelan officials see domestic problems as results of international pressure. Both perspectives contain truth, but neither captures the full picture. The sanctions debate also reveals different assumptions about state sovereignty. International critics argue that Venezuelan government lost legitimacy through democratic backsliding. Therefore, external pressure is justified. Venezuelan officials argue that sovereignty is inviolable regardless of domestic governance. Therefore, external pressure is illegitimate. These aren't just diplomatic positions. They represent different theories about how the international system should work. The first assumes that domestic legitimacy determines international recognition. The second assumes that international recognition should protect domestic autonomy. The success question. The most uncomfortable question about Venezuela is also the simplest. What would success look like? International observers assume they know the answer. Democratic governance, market economics, institutional stability. But these metrics reveal more about observer preferences than Venezuelan needs. Venezuela's oil wealth created possibilities that don't exist elsewhere. With proper management, petroleum revenues could theoretically eliminate poverty, provide universal health care and education, and create unprecedented social equality. But proper management itself is a contested concept. Should oil wealth be saved for future generations, invested in productive capacity, or distributed to current citizens? Should the state prioritize economic efficiency or social equity? Should the goal be integration into global markets or development of domestic capacity? Different answers to these questions produce different definitions of success. The Chavez government chose equity over efficiency, distribution over accumulation, domestic development over international integration. This choice appears obviously wrong from perspectives that prioritize economic growth, but it appears obviously right from perspectives that prioritize social justice. International criticism of Venezuelan economic policies often focuses on their inefficiency. State price controls created shortages. Currency controls generated black markets. Industrial policy failed to diversify the economy. These criticisms are factually accurate, but they assume that efficiency should be the primary goal. What if the goal was different? What if the purpose was to demonstrate that oil wealth belongs to everyone, not just elites? What if the point was to prioritize social needs over market signals? What if the objective was to prove that poor countries don't have to accept subordinate positions in global hierarchies? From these perspectives, Venezuelan policies weren't failed attempts at conventional development. They were successful attempts at alternative development. The fact that they didn't produce economic growth according to standard metrics doesn't mean they failed to achieve their actual objectives. The mirror breaks. The story we tell about Venezuela reveals our own story. It shows what we value, what we fear, and what we cannot imagine. The reason Venezuela confounds expectations isn't because it's uniquely dysfunctional. It's because it represents a different way of organizing society. Every society makes trade-offs between competing values: market efficiency versus social equity, individual freedom versus collective solidarity, present consumption versus future investment, democratic process versus democratic outcomes. Venezuela made different trade-offs than its observers expected, and those observers interpreted the difference as failure. But trade-offs themselves aren't failures. They're choices that reveal priorities. The Venezuelan choice to prioritize redistribution over growth, sovereignty over integration, and popular participation over institutional stability wasn't objectively wrong. It was subjectively different. The real Venezuela paradox isn't economic or political. It's perceptual. A country can simultaneously be failing according to some metrics and succeeding according to others. A government can be illegitimate by some standards and legitimate by others. A society can be collapsing in some ways and innovating in others. Understanding Venezuela requires abandoning the assumption that there's one correct way to organize society. It requires accepting that different societies can pursue different objectives through different means. It requires recognizing that our explanations often say more about our expectations than about their subjects. The Venezuelan experiment may have failed to achieve its stated objectives, but it succeeded in revealing the limitations of our analytical frameworks. It showed that reality is more complex than our theories, that other people have different priorities than we assume, and that the world is big enough for different ways of living. This is the deepest lesson of the Venezuela story. Not that socialism doesn't work or that wealth corrupts, but that our certainties are more fragile than we think. Every time we explain Venezuela's problems with complete confidence, we reveal how little we understand about the complexity of human societies. The question isn't why Venezuela failed. The question is why we need Venezuela to fail in ways that confirm our existing beliefs. Until we answer that question, we'll keep getting Venezuela wrong